afternoon, everybody. I'm Michèle Flournoy, the co-founder and chair of CNAS, and it's really a pleasure to be here with Mike Vickers today to talk about his new book, which is called By All Means Available, Memoirs of a Life in Intelligence, Special Operations, and Strategy. It is available on Amazon for those of you who want to go out and get it. And thank you especially to our online audience for joining us. As we go through this talk, if you think of some questions you'd like to ask Mike, please enter them in the chat box on cnas.org/live or use hashtag CNAS2023 on Twitter. So again, welcome. This is really a pleasure because I've had a chance to work with Mike Vickers in many different capacities, and he has one of these larger-than-life stories. When you read his book, you can't decide whether you're reading a memoir or a foreign policy tome or a spy novel. It's a very exciting read and just documents an incredible life of public service. There is something in this book for everyone. Mike started his career as a special forces soldier. He then later became an officer in the CIA, and then after some other incarnations, he ended up as a senior official in the Pentagon, first as the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations and Low-Intensity Conflict, and there's something about capabilities in there too.
Kitchen sink.
And then later as, where we worked most closely together as Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence. So an incredibly storied career that spanned several decades. So I really want to just start by kind of going through the narrative arc of your experience and start with the basic question of why did you write this memoir? What are the key themes and lessons learned that you wanted to get across?
So 3 reasons, really. I was fortunate enough in my career to participate in 3, major historical events. Our CIA operation that drove the Soviets out of Afghanistan in the 1980s. It was the only defeat the Red Army suffered in its history and helped bring an end to the Cold War. And then a number of our campaigns against al-Qaeda, particularly after the core group reestablished sanctuary in the Afghanistan-Pakistan border region, and then other regions of the world, Yemen and elsewhere. And then the operation that we participated in that brought justice to Osama bin Laden. So I felt I had a duty to history to record it from a sub-cabinet official's point of view, where we're doing a lot of the operational strategy. And then a duty to my fellow American citizens. We keep a lot of secrets in the intelligence and special ops world, but those things that we can shed a little light on, I felt I had an obligation to do that. And then perhaps most importantly, to our future intelligence officers, special operators, and strategists, to pass on any lessons learned to help them win. And so that was the major reasons. The themes of the book are really one about why we're very successful in strategy when people don't think we can be in a lot of cases, and why we stumble when we should have a much easier time of it. And there are a number of reasons I try to outline for that, about achieving escalation dominance in certain areas. And then and then I have different things about intelligence, special ops, and strategy. But another lesson that really has impacted me on my career is the importance of individuals. Having the right person in the right place, the right mentor sometimes, which I was blessed with over and over again, but right colleagues really make all the difference in the world. And it's not that these people are smarter or necessarily better. They're just the right person for that job at that time. And that moves history in a lot of cases.
That's great. So we share something in our backgrounds that we both grew up in Southern California. And you went to Hollywood High, I went to a rival high school. But so you're 19 years old and you decide, I'm going to be a Green Beret. So what in the world was young Mike Vickers thinking about when he joined the Army?
So 2 things. One, up until then, I really wanted to be a professional quarterback or baseball player. And I realized that wasn't happening. And so I thought, what am I going to do with my life? And I decided I wanted to make a contribution to national security, do something really adventurous and challenging, but also where an individual could make a big difference. And so that drew me to the Special Forces and CIA. And as it turned out, like a lot of people in life, I had a high school teacher my senior year who, when I was supposed to be researching a term paper in the library, plopped a copy of the New York Times down in front of me and said, "You might be interested in this." And it was about a big CIA paramilitary operation in Laos during the Vietnam War. And so I don't know why he thought I would be interested, but I was. And I thought, you know, maybe I could lead secret armies and all this.
Yeah,
it sounded pretty cool.
So you're in Special Forces, and in the book you describe some pretty interesting aspects of the training, and particularly a few close calls you had with parachute jumps. But the one that really caught me was this idea that you were training to parachute into Eastern Europe with a backpack nuclear weapon in the event of a war with the Soviet Union. Is that actually true?
It is actually true. You know,
did you guys figure about the blast radius versus how fast you could run? I mean,
yeah,
any concerns on that?
That was part of it. You know, when I was 23 years old, it seemed like a good idea. You know, not so much later in life. But a small group of us were trained. You know, in the Cold War, we had nuclear weapons for everything. Fire from artillery and drop bombs from fighters. And so Special Operations Forces had their element. And the mission was to try to halt the follow-on Soviet forces to give NATO forces a chance because they were outnumbered. So you'd place it in a bit of key terrain. And you'd actually have to place the device, arm it, you know, assuming you got the instructions from the National Command Authority, and then have a position where you could make sure nobody took it. And so you had to actually stay within, dig yourself in and stay within the blast radius. So funny story, when I was an assistant secretary, engineers at Sandia Labs in Albuquerque came to see me on some other problem. And we in Special Forces always thought as soon as we turned that timer and the device was set, it was going to go, you know, supposedly 24 hours, but it would go off as soon as you touched the darn thing. And they opened up a briefing for me and said, you know, we never got that timer to work properly. So,
great. So then, so you decide you want to be an officer, and you go to officer candidate school, and you come back to Special Forces. So what was that like, and how did that, you know, what was your focus as an officer in that community? Yeah,
so I had the chance as a lieutenant to command at a senior captain level a troop, and so you know, I wanted to do that. And wars, this was the early 1980s, and so Central America was the hot place to be with El Salvador and other things. And then I was selected to command a counterterrorism intelligence unit, and so I was involved in a couple hostage rescue operations and other things. But I'd pretty much decided when I finished my tour I was going to go to CIA, and so that influenced it as well. I thought better you know, a command tour in Special Forces than working my way up the infantry ranks, and so that's how I decided.
Okay. So in 1983, you joined the CIA, and the next year, you're selected as the CIA's lead for the Afghanistan Covert Action Program. And you described this as the job of a lifetime. For many of you who've either read the novel or seen the movie of Charlie Wilson's War, Mike is actually figured quite prominently. But can you describe what was that experience like, and why was it a sort of peak experience for you?
Yeah, so you know, it had come on the heels of 13 years of training, you know, pretty much to fight the Soviets or fighting their proxies, and so this was the opportunity to take the fight to our main enemy. You know, elsewhere it was Cubans, or in Africa, or Sandinistas in Central America, and so this was the granddaddy of these proxy wars in the 1980s. The budget had just been quadrupled. When I was in Special Forces, we were trained to work with, say, a 500 to 1,500 person guerrilla organization. There were 150,000 Afghan fighters, so I felt like I'd been promoted from captain to field marshal, you know, overnight. So it was just an extraordinary experience.
And so, are there lessons from, I mean, the fact that we were able to, you know, support the Afghans in defeating the Soviets, driving them out of Afghanistan? When you look at today's wars, like the Russian war in Ukraine, are there lessons learned that you think apply from that chapter to things that we're seeing today?
Yeah, I mean, it's a conventional overt war, but still an indirect war from our perspective in Ukraine. And some of the same principles that enabled us to defeat the Soviets, the scale that we expanded and the speed at which we did that. You know, we and the Soviets both surged at the same time in 1985. When Mikhail Gorbachev came to power, he increased Soviet forces in Afghanistan by 30,000 troops and gave them 18 months to win it, something we would do in our surges later. And we at CIA matched that and raised it as well. And and I think that the scale and scope of weapons that we provide and how fast we provide them have a big impact on the battlefield. And so that's the big lesson, I think.
So after enjoying that success at CIA in terms of the mission, you decide to leave. Why did you decide to leave?
Yeah, I still don't know if I made the right decision, particularly after 9/11. But the reason was I had been wildly successful, maybe spoiled by success, and had gotten promoted pretty rapidly and worked at the top levels of the agency. And my senior officers were telling me, things like this come around, if you're lucky, once every 25 years. What are you going to do the next 20 years, And so they offered me some nice jobs, but I hadn't been to graduate school yet, and so I thought, well, maybe what I should do is go off to graduate school and then come back into government later. And it turned out it worked out, but it wasn't really a grand design. It just worked out that way.
Right.
But and that marked the transition from really, a decade and a half of operational stuff to then later policy things.
So after 9/11, you end up coming back into government as the Assistant Secretary for SOLIC. And this is in the George W. Bush administration. And you were tasked with working alongside your former friends at the CIA to come up with a strategy for disrupting and dismantling al-Qaeda in the Afghan-Pakistan border region. So tell us about how did you develop that strategy? What are some of the key lessons learned out of that chapter?
So what had happened, we had a very successful campaign in Afghanistan in 2001, and al-Qaeda, unfortunately, a lot of al-Qaeda's senior leadership got away and went into the border region. Some went to Iran. And by 2005 and 2006, the threat to the American homeland had grown dramatically again. And so, we had this transatlantic airliner plot where they were going to blow up 10 airliners flying from the UK to the United States, and that's why we have these TSA, 3-ounce baggie restrictions and all that from that period. Good intelligence broke that up. And also, our Pakistani ally was making deals with some of these, those who were providing safe haven to al-Qaeda, the Haqqani network in particular. And so President Bush realized that the strategy that we had, relying essentially on Pakistan and doing a drone strike periodically when the Pakistanis would authorize it, wasn't working. There was this grave threat to the American homeland again. And so he asked us to come up with a new strategy, which had several elements: far more intense predator strikes or drone strikes, policy changes authorizing what's called signature strikes and targeting a group based on its signature, expanding the target list, and a number of others. And then the most important was we were going to do them unilaterally and then notify the Pakistanis concurrently after we did the strike. And that made all the difference. And so, as former CIA Director Mike Hayden said, in 2007 we didn't take one al-Qaeda high-value target off the battlefield in the border region. In the last 5 months of 2008, we took 8 off. And so we went from 0 for 07, as Mike put it, to 8 for 08, and it picked up from there. And this is one of these things where there was really good continuity in foreign policy between late George W. Bush and the beginning of the first term of the Obama administration, in which you served as undersecretary, that President Obama continued this strategy and then accelerated it. And so by 2012, core Al-Qaeda was really beaten up pretty badly. Their ability to plan and do other things was hit pretty hard.
And yet the drone campaign was not without controversy and elicited some criticism, particularly over press accounts of collateral damage and civilian deaths and so forth. Can you talk about how you view the validity of that criticism and the kinds of steps that were taken subsequently to try to reduce collateral damage from the signature strikes and others?
Yeah, so there's some non-combatant deaths or collateral damage, to use the euphemism. They're much less than a number of these outside agencies have reported. In fact, late in the Obama administration, President Obama released a number of figures about the number of strikes we did in various regions, the number of combatant deaths, and the number of non-combatant deaths. And the non-combatants are between 60 and 120, and some of the lessons. So one, the restrictions on this air campaign are greater than any other air campaign. Because they're in areas where we're not in active war zones, we have to have near certainty that there's no collateral damage, that the target is identified properly, and that there's no non-combatants. When someone is not visible to you at all, so like if a child ran in suddenly, we would move the weapon right off. But if there were someone in a building that you just didn't know about, then you can get collateral damage. Or if you strike a large group where you don't know everybody in that group, again, you might get some collateral damage. And so it tends to be a little lumpy, and it's certainly not perfect, but the record is like 98, 99% successful.
Okay. So President Obama is elected, the administration comes in, President decides to ask Secretary Gates to stay on as SecDef, and you were one of a very few group of people who were asked to stay on from the Bush administration to the Obama administration. And one of our first tasks together was to work on the Afghanistan strategy. Talk a little bit about where Afghanistan was at that point. Remember, we'd gone into Afghanistan in 2001 after the 9/11 attacks. But then the administration chose to go into Iraq. And in some ways, it kind of put Afghanistan on the back burner as a economy of force mission while all attention got shifted to Iraq. So when Obama comes in, he has a different sense of the priorities and really wants to prioritize meeting our objectives in Afghanistan. So talk a little bit about kind of that experience of working on that new strategy and what we were trying to accomplish there.
Yeah, so it's very different depending on the snapshot in time. So, for the first few years in Afghanistan, the insurgency is mostly in the south of Afghanistan, and then it starts spreading to the east and elsewhere. And the Pakistanis give more leeway to the Taliban group out of Quetta and southwestern Pakistan, and the Haqqanis and others in the federal administered tribal areas. And so by 2006 to 2008, it's getting much worse. There's just no more troops to be able to send. And then as President Obama takes office, the situation in Iraq was horrible in 2006. It had gotten a lot better by 2009, and then really a lot better by 2010. And Afghanistan was just deteriorating. And so we went through a series of little mini surges, late Bush, and then the very beginning of Obama, and then when Stan McChrystal became our commander in Afghanistan, that you and I had helped convince Secretary Gates that he was the guy for the job. He recommended a big increase, and so the question then was large National Security Council reviews for, I think it was like 4 or 5 months or something, through the whole fall of 2009. And what we were going to do with the element, how many troops were we going to send? So we settled on 30,000 additional, bringing up to 100, but also NATO increase of 7,500 or so. A lot more special operators for special operations raids, and eventually developed this tribal engagement program, the Afghan local police that helped really take the rural areas away from the Taliban. And we knew we couldn't defeat the Taliban, given their sanctuary in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, and their embeddedness in Afghan society, but we could push them back maybe to 2004 levels or so, which we did in 18 months, but that's not enough. And so, they came back after that while we were transitioning to Afghan primary security responsibility, which was completed in 2015. So the strategy was a tactical and operational success, but a temporary one, and then it was followed by a strategy that did transition responsibility, but then with a tragic ending.
Yeah. So talk to me, how do you view how things ended for the United States in Afghanistan?
Oh, I think it was horrible. I think it was, we had made a lot of mistakes in Afghanistan over 20 years in having nation-building objectives that weren't realistic, and probably should have stayed more focused on our narrow counterterrorism objective, which was preventing another 9/11 attack. And there's some nation building you have to do to be able to do that. But we had largely successfully transitioned to Afghan security forces. The key is that we maintained aid and maintained advisors and were willing to use U.S. air power. And all those things started collapsing in the late Trump administration and the first year of the Biden administration, with tragic results that the Taliban took over. And so from my perspective, the Afghans played a role in helping us win the Cold War. They played a role in kicking Al-Qaeda out of Afghanistan after the 9/11 attacks. And it's a terrible fate. And given Afghanistan's location, one, we hope it doesn't become jihad central again. That may take some time. But also, its strategic location between China, Russia, and Iran ought to make you think twice about whether you don't want to be there or not. So.
Yeah. So in 2011, you are nominated and confirmed as Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence, and it's wearing that hat that you were part of the planning of the bin Laden raid. So tell us a little bit about your experience in that position, and specifically your experience as part of planning for the raid that brought bin Laden to justice.
Yeah, so that consumed a big chunk of my time between the period when we finally thought we found him in Abbottabad in late August 2010 till when we did the raid on May 1st, 2011. And so, at the beginning, the intelligence was very restricted, and then we were able to expand it a little bit. But, it was the biggest secret in the U.S. government. So initially, there were only 4 of us briefed on it by Director Panetta and Michael Morrell, Gates, me, and the chairman and vice chairman. And then, as we were moving to operational and policy with the White House at the beginning of 11, you may recall this, but I said, I got to have my boss, I'm still assistant secretary at this time, I got to have my boss, the undersecretary for policy, if we're going to be having White House deputies meetings on this stuff. And CIA was very good about that. And then I worked on developing the initial options, which ranged from B-2 strikes to various kinds of special operations raids, and then eventually a drone operation that wasn't a very good idea, but we had it on the table anyway once the B-2 strike was taken off the table, and fortunately we settled in the right place.
Right. The thing that really struck me about that period was not only that we were able to keep a secret, which is rare, too rare in the U.S. government, but that the rigor with which the intelligence was red-teamed and analyzed and analyzed again, the rigor with which the options were analyzed, the rigor with which, each option had certain risks associated with it, and there was just endless contingency planning to think about the what-ifs. What if it's a raid and the helicopter goes down? Okay, we had a plan for that when it happened. What if? So that you're just consistently trying to buy down the risk. And then ultimately, at the end of the day, President Obama, there was no consensus. When he went around the room and for advice, you had, one principal say, I don't think we should do it, it's too high risk. You had several recommend the raid, and you had others recommend the drone strike, and so he was left to make a tough decision without that firm consensus behind him. I think one of the proudest moments we had together is when we had our Speak Truth to Power moment, where we went in together to convince Secretary Gates to support the raid option. So that was a good moment. So I want to break from counterterrorism in Afghanistan and think, you've also thought a lot about, and we haven't talked much about this, but you've also spent time out of government in the think tank world as an analyst. And in that capacity, you've thought a lot about great power competition and deterrence. And so in your book, you talk about how you use the term new Cold War, I believe, but how can we win a new Cold War with China and Russia? And so I wanted to ask you, what do you think winning with regard to China in particular, but also Russia, looks like? And what are the implications for how, what we're doing in Ukraine, and whether we should be doing more or different?
So when I first started working on this problem in my period out of government with the late Andy Marshall, it was really focused on how do we transform the U.S. military to deal with this rising China threat in the Western Pacific, and particularly capabilities that you know well, called anti-access aerial denial, where they could take away our air bases or our ability to have surface ships off their coast. The Chinese were the best students of the Persian Gulf War, Desert Storm. The big conclusion they drew out of that, of any other military, was never let the United States have 6 months to build up combat power right on your doorstep and then beat your brains in. Prevent them from coming there in the first place, and that's what they have essentially done. And so, through various quadrennial defense reviews, we started a new bomber program and shifted weight to the submarine force and started building our space capabilities, and all that's necessary but not sufficient. And later in my time as USDI, from probably 2013 on, I really began thinking about, okay, so what would if you're successful at this, you deter war, but that doesn't mean you win the long-term competition. And so how do you win the long-term competition with China? And that really comes down to economic and technological competition over the next 20, 30 years. Who's going to have the world's leading industries, who's going to win the tech arms race in artificial intelligence and quantum computing and synthetic biology, et cetera. And then also, which societies are the most resilient. One of the lessons we learned from the first Cold War is that it's a systems competition. It's really our system against theirs, we and our allies against them. And so you have to take all that into account, and we have a lot of advantages. But the challenge, one of the things I wrote in the book about competing with China and Russia in the long time is getting our domestic house in order is absolutely number one. If we don't do that, we won't succeed in these other areas. And then, you've got to do the deterrence, and you've got to try to maintain the intelligence advantage that we developed in the Cold War, and hopefully have some successful covert actions. But it really starts at home, and then it starts with that economic and technological competitions. And if you do that well, the other stuff will probably follow suit.
So investing in the drivers of our own economic and technological competitiveness.
Yeah, and then what does winning looks like? You don't, as the original Cold War, where George Kennan, it's indefinite in length. You have an idea how you want it to end. You want them to modify in some way. They may collapse and have their government change, but you don't know that. But you certainly want to make sure you're well postured 30 years from now to still be international leader, and you've got to do those things.
But for the more immediate, near-term challenge of deterrence, we have two nuclear-armed powers. I think any direct conflict between the United States and China could escalate to be a global catastrophe. So when you think about what should we be doing to deter a leader like President Xi to not reach for the use of force vis-a-vis Taiwan anytime in the near to medium term, are there things you think we should be doing that we're not, or we should be doing more of? If you were advising the Secretary of Defense, what would you say?
Yeah, so a couple of things. One, you want to pose a lot of military dilemmas for them rather than one that they can't solve. They think they've solved the you know, you have a fighter air force and you have a lot of surface ships that you're going to bring really close to me and I can attack them in various ways. And so the more capability we have to strike from longer range or from under the sea or to win the space fight or the cyber fight, the more that they may think this isn't a good idea to get into this in the first place. And then if there is an invasion of Taiwan, then it really comes down to, do you have enough munitions to stop it? And this is where one of the lessons of Ukraine really plays out. That is, you know, America was the arsenal of democracy in World War II, and we've lost a lot of that capability. The munitions you would need in a China-Taiwan fight are very different, you know, anti-ship missiles and a range of things than what we need in Ukraine, artillery rounds and now the cluster munitions and others. But the principle's the same, is you need a lot of them.
Yeah.
And so if you have that, then as I said, hopefully you deter this conflict because there is the risk of escalation and there is the risk of shifting power balances if one side were to win. But then you have the rest of the competition. And you know, another lesson of the Cold War is that because of that escalation risk, it's more likely you're going to have indirect conflict, maybe one side direct as Russia is in Ukraine, and then we're in the indirect role, but you can't rule out direct conflict. And so you've got to be prepared to deal with that and the risk of nuclear escalation, as we did in the Cold War, and then hopefully you deter it.
Yeah. There is, I mean, this is one of the rare areas these days for bipartisan consensus, the China challenge, and the rise of a more aggressive or assertive China that may not play by the international rules of the road. But there is a school of thought, it's minority, but there's a dissenting school that says, look at Chinese demographics. They're going to get old. The population's going to age before it gets rich. They have all these environmental issues. The CCP's hold on power is more brittle than we think. Witness the mishandling of COVID and the reaction to that. How do you think about that argument, that the risk of China's weakness or disintegration is greater than the risk of their rise and challenge? I mean, I personally don't buy it, but I'm wondering, how do you answer that?
So I buy it on one level and don't buy it on another. So is it a plausible scenario that you have to prepare for? Yes. I mean, they have all those challenges and they could stumble. You know, another lesson of the first Cold War is we really misassessed, and some very, very bright people like Henry Kissinger misassessed the US-Soviet competition in the late 70s when the Soviets were on a roll. They were winning everywhere and we weren't, but their society was rotten. We overestimated it for a while. And then it became clear, you know, sort of a decade later, the real trouble they were in. You know, and the same may be true for China. Where I don't agree, I think, like you, is that's a more dangerous scenario than if everything goes really well for China and they can surpass us in the international system. I think that's the more dangerous scenario for the United States.
I'm going to ask you one more question about Russia-Ukraine, but for the audience, be thinking about your questions. And if you're with us virtually, again, you can submit your question in the chat box of cnas.org/live or use hashtag CNAS2023 on Twitter. So we are in this moment within the war in Ukraine where there's been huge public expectation of an imminent, or the counteroffensive that Ukrainians have begun. Obviously very difficult, maybe going slower than some anticipated because the Russians had so much time to dig in and reinforce. But how do you see, where do you think this war is going? How do you think this ends? Is there anything more you think we should be doing to support Ukraine?
Yeah, so I wish the war would end this year, but I don't think it will. I think it will go into next year. And I think the Ukrainians are still lacking important capabilities. Deep strike systems like the Army Tactical Missile System, which has a range of 300 kilometers that would allow them to strike a lot of, within Ukraine, Russian command and control and logistical facilities, et cetera, to make it tougher for the Russians to reinforce the front. And then air power. You know, we would never, faced with this problem of a dug-in Russian defenses, we would never fight. The US military would never fight the way we're asking Ukraine to fight. which is without air power, which means, when they're trying to clear these minefields, they have the engineering equipment to do it, explosive charges and stuff, but they come under fire from the Russians when they try to do it. So it's like back to 1918. You have small groups of Ukrainians, on their bellies with bayonets trying to, clear a path through the minefield without getting discovered. And it's not a way to do a major counteroffensive. So I wish, it's possible the Russian army will break, as it did in Kharkiv and other places, but they've had time to dig in, and I wouldn't necessarily count on it. So the Biden administration is supposedly considering now giving the Ukrainians the ATACMS, or Army Tactical Missile System. I hope they do. And we're on the path at least to get them F-16s in training and some other aircraft. But that will take some time. I wish we had started that many months ago. Then I think this counteroffensive would have a better chance of success. But it's important that the Ukrainians win. I mean, it's you mentioned earlier about different China theories. There are also different geopolitical theories about who cares about Russia? It's a European problem, or they're a declining power, or all our focus should be on China. And one, I don't really, yes, China's our biggest challenge, but I don't buy like strategic monism. You better pay attention to global jihadists. It's economy of force, but you don't want another 9/11. And the best thing we can do to increase our deterrence with China is to defeat Russia. And also Europe, as it was in the beginning of the Cold War, Europe is more important to the future of American strategy, I think, against China, economically and other things, than a lot of people realize. It's an interconnected world, and you want to make sure they're our allies and on our side, and then we've got a much better chance.
Right, thank you. So we're going to open it up for questions from the audience first here at CNAS. So any questions? Yes, and please tell us who you are and ask your question.
Hi, Lisa Curtis. I'm the director of the Indo-Pacific Security Program here at CNAS. Thank you. This has been incredibly interesting. You have quite a storied career, and it's been so interesting. Thank you for sharing it with us. I want to ask you, based on all your experience on Afghanistan, a little bit more on Afghanistan. Number one, do you think that the Doha deal, as it was negotiated, was necessary for the U.S. To withdraw from Afghanistan? Or do you think there are other ways that the U.S. could have more gracefully withdrawn its troops from Afghanistan? That's one. Second is, could you tell us what you think the best U.S. policy toward Afghanistan would be now? I know there is talk of the U.S. cooperating with the Taliban against ISIS-K, but I guess my question is, do you really think that the Taliban is going to be helpful in the end in terms of the U.S. meeting its counterterrorism interests in Afghanistan, given their continued relationship with al-Qaeda? And do you think it's worth it to just sort of ignore what's happening in terms of the persecution of women and girls in that country, to kind of embolden the Taliban by, giving them legitimacy by cooperating with them, even if it is against ISIS-K? Thank you.
So let me start with the last part. No, I do not think it is worth it to cooperate with the Taliban, nor do I think it's wise. For the reasons you suggested, that they're still alive. The Haqqanis are longtime supporters of al-Qaeda, safe haven providers, and those relationships haven't changed. ISIS-K is a threat. It's a little bigger threat right now than al-Qaeda is, but I'd bet on al-Qaeda over the longer term. And to break faith with the Afghan people more, I mean, they're in a tough situation right now, but to break faith with those women and girls and others over successive administrations going forward, I think would be a mistake for American foreign policy has to be both values and interests, and I think we would really be sacrificing our values for marginal counterterrorism gain. We still have over-the-horizon capabilities, not as effective as we would be if we still had a small presence. The Doha agreement was a terrible agreement and implemented even worse. I don't know if we were ever really serious. H.R. McMaster has called it a surrender agreement. I think that's pretty accurate, actually. it let a lot of prisoners out and Al-Qaeda and others out of Afghan jails. I don't think there was a great way to, I think the best we could do is draw down our troops to a real small level, not having them in combatant roles, but maintain an aid relationship. And I think we would be much better off. Taliban never could have come to power if we had maintained an economy of force operation there. We didn't need combat forces anymore other than air power in extremis. So I just think the whole idea was, it was looking at Afghanistan through this prism of forever war, something that doesn't matter to us. Disengaging from the region was one of the reasons we ended up with 9/11, and that plus not denying Al-Qaeda sanctuary in Afghanistan for a lot of years, something we never would have done and we didn't after 2001, but we did before 2001. So I think those are the lessons that we ignore at our peril. And,
other questions? Yes, please, go ahead.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for sharing your experiences with us. My name is Joshua Fitt. I'm also with the Indo-Pacific Security Program here. My question is about your grad school experience, actually. So you mentioned that after a number of very influential and important positions in the Special Forces community and others, that you went to grad school. So with that level of experience, how did you take advantage of the opportunities that grad school provided you?
So first I went to Wharton for an MBA thinking that I would make a lot of money and then go back into government. That didn't work too well. It worked a little bit, but I really missed national security, and so I right away went to Johns Hopkins for a PhD in international relations and strategic studies. And in the 1990s, in Andy Marshall's office, the big thing was the rise of China and this thing called the revolution in military affairs, that war would be transformed over the next few decades. And so I did a lot of work in that area, and I wrote my PhD dissertation on the theory and history of military revolutions going back to the chariot. So 4,000 years of military history. It took almost 4,000 years to finish the darn dissertation, which was 1,000 pages and 3 volumes by the time I was done. But it was a mid-career experience for me, not like normal people do graduate school. And it was like a war college in some respects. It helped broaden my thinking to things like nuclear strategy and transformation, conventional transformation, and how wars are won and lost, that became valuable as I became a senior policymaker, that I didn't really need at the time. I learned, so then that plus the work I did for the Pentagon, I got expertise in space and cyber and undersea warfare, a lot of things that I didn't have operational experience in, that became valuable later as a senior defense official. So in that sense, it was great.
I'll ask another question. One thing that you were very involved in as USDI that we haven't talked about much is trying to prevent Iran's acquisition of enough nuclear material for a nuclear weapon. This is like one of those, Groundhog Day scenarios where here we are back again because of some errors in U.S. policy, in my view, Trump walking away from the JCPOA agreement and so forth, that we're back to a situation where Iran is dangerously close to having enough enriched material to build a nuclear weapon. Can you derive any lessons from this experience, but also any suggestions on what U.S. policy should be doing now to prevent that acquisition?
Yeah, so our objectives were to, I was more on the operational side of things rather than the policy and sanction side. But, our objective was to at least delay the time it would take for the Iranians to get the bomb so that diplomacy could work. If we could prevent it, great, but at least we wanted to buy time for diplomacy. And we were pretty successful through a variety of measures in doing that, through pressure on the economy and some other things I can't talk about. And And that set up JCPOA. And JCPOA wasn't the perfect agreement. It didn't really deal with Iran's missiles or its malign influence, but it did set them back a lot. And it wasn't in perpetuity. It had a sunset clause, but it was still better than the alternative of where they have built up like crazy since then. And so the Iranian strategy has been to make sure they have all the capabilities so when they want to go nuclear, if they do, and they haven't, they want to be at the threshold of it, and to make it as easy to cross the line as possible without crossing it. And and our objective is to get them further back from that line or convince them ideally that they don't want to do that. And so JCPOA was an imperfect measure, but the best option we had at the time. And we're in worse shape today than we were, then certainly. So I think how you get that back right now is another question. The Iranians seem less interested right now than for domestic political reasons and others than they were after a lot of pressure had been put on them, leading up to JCPOA. But the objective remains the same.
Yeah. So another question is, you spent a long time in the intelligence community. At the time you were there, the initial focus was Cold War, Soviet Union, but then for a lot of your tenure, it was really focused on the transnational terrorism problem. Now we're faced with, this renewed challenge with a rising China. This requires a pretty huge pivot for the intelligence community from focusing on supporting kind of the tactical and operational intelligence requirements for counterterrorism to dealing with a big multidimensional strategic threat that has not just military dimensions, but economic, technological, all kinds of other things. What are the kinds of big muscle movements the intelligence community needs to make to be able to position itself to really give policymakers, sort of thoughtful and anticipatory intelligence about China going forward? And are we doing enough to make that shift?
Yeah, there are a number. So my last a couple years at least as USDI, I really started focusing on this problem of how to transform defense intelligence, all our agencies, for this great power challenge. And it has a number of dimensions. So one of them is, now that space is contested, having our space architecture be more defensible than it had been. And so there's a lot of things you need to do there to make sure that you're going to get the intelligence you need in war if someone wants to target you, which a number of our adversaries have developed the capabilities in that area. And then, there are, for military deterrence, there are different operational problems, to deal with the anti-access threat. You need different kinds of intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance aircraft than you use in counterterrorism or that you had used in the Cold War, because the battlefield geometry is just different in East Asia. And so there are changes there. And the ratio between armed intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance and strike platforms, whether from the sea or in the air, is different too. You need a lot more. This is where it's similar to counterterrorism. If you're hunting mobile missiles, the challenge is finding them. And if you've got a bomb aboard, once you find them, you can take them out. You just got to find them and fix them. And so there, a number of implications for our policy there. But then you hit on really the important one, which is if the central competition is really economic and technological and global influence, do you have not just the collection mechanisms, but the analytical cadre and expertise to really advise policymakers in this area? And that's where you have to transform the workforce. It's not just about widgets and things. It's about different people you bring into intelligence to do that. And so we can think, for instance, okay, I need quantum scientists and some of these exotic things that I'm really competing for, but you also need people who understand this information environment, which is difficult. And so it really is transformation of the workforce. And then as we were bringing some of our elements out of war zones, like DIA was trying to reorient them toward more strategic collection and analysis for this problem. And different things apply to different agencies. You have volumes of information you got to have automation or you can't keep up with. At NSA, you're always worried about going dark, that somehow you're not going to be able to read the other guy's mail. And with this surveillance state, with technical surveillance, being able to do human operations in denied areas is a new level of challenge we have to adapt to. So it cuts across the board with intelligence, but we're up to it.
So I think we have time for one more question. Go ahead. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Why don't you wait for the mic, please? And I might squeeze one more in. We'll see how long your question is.
Hi, thank you so much for speaking with us. My name is Jocelyn Trainer. I'm a researcher here on our Energy, Economics, and Security program. Going back to your comments about the domestic population in Russia and China, how do you view the U.S. domestic population right now? I know you just touched on the need to continue developing our workforce, but noting the kind of turbulent years we've had within our politics and how polarizing it comes, to what degree is this on the radar of our intelligence community, and are we in a good place? Is it worrisome? And potentially, if it is worrisome, what are some recommendations you would suggest to focus on?
Yeah, so this, it's not my area of expertise, but it is the thing I worry the most about. So if you look at, Wall Street Journal ran a good series, I think a couple months ago maybe, about changing attitudes in the United States toward national security and a range of issues that are worrisome long-term trends. And those are fundamentally not for national security strategists like us to solve. It's more for political leadership to try to do, and other leaders in the country, in civic organizations and business organizations, et cetera, to build those senses of community and some degree of sufficient national unity to be able to prosecute a long-term competition. You don't have to agree on everything. You can have different policies, different administrations, but you need that unity and resilience that enables you to at least carry out a coherent foreign policy and make other investments you need to do. And that has a number of implications in terms of redistributing, targeting government investment properly to redistribute capabilities so they're not quite so concentrated in some areas. The interstate, we did a much better job than people realize in the 1950s. Building up our science and technological talent, the interstate highway system, that was originally designed to be able to move nuclear weapons around more rapidly, but it had enormous economic benefits in unifying the country and others. And so you can think about analogs to that today, but I think it's very important. And I'm glad to see CNAS doing not just Indo-Pacific, but energy and other issues. Nuclear fusion has always been 50 years away. This time we may really mean it. It may actually be 20 or 30 years away.
Yeah.
So it's an important area.
I just want to close with a final question. And I know that with 42 years of public service, you probably have a lot of awards and citations. But I think one of the ones that was most meaningful was the Presidential National Security Medal that you received from President Obama, where he said that, for 42 years, you've had the knack of being precisely where the nation needed you most. So just a reflection on what are you most proud of in your career, and what advice would you give to the next generation of young national security professionals who are entering service? So
that wonderful quote has triggered a lot of comparisons to Forrest Gump, which I don't think are entirely flattering, but in any event. So the big historic events that I was blessed with is one thing, but I think what I'm, most proud of, but happiest about is the important missions, the important purpose that I was blessed to spend a lot of my life on, and with extraordinary colleagues who were in that mission with me. I mean, that's what as I look back at various areas, and a lot of those colleagues, everything I did was made possible by someone else, either believing in me or co-working with me or others. And so, that's what I really feel best about. I mean, it's not, some operational accomplishment or some job title or anything. It's really that pattern of doing something important and working with great people committed to that cause.
Well, thank you for your life of service. Thank you for sharing your insights with us. And again, go read the book. It's really, don't read it at night because it might keep you up, but it's a really good read and full of wonderful experiences and stories, but also just great insights and lessons. So please join me in thanking Mike Vickers.
And if it did keep you up, you can always switch to my dissertation, and that will put you to sleep.
Okay, great. Thank you, everybody. And thanks to our online audience as well.